It was early July when I first saw the path. It was a dark point in a ring of feather bells, and it had a pole to it, an empty wanting, sitting in the tree line. I grew up in a pretty rural part of southern Missouri, in a house in the Ozarks. It was a beautiful place, and a beautiful childhood. Dad bought the land empty and built the house himself as a distraction from drinking. Mom put her foot down shortly after I was born, and Dad knew that she was right. So we bought the land, and instead of going out after work, he'd go to the land and work on the house, giving himself a choice between drinking himself to death or building his dream house worked like a charm, and he'd been 15 years sober when he died. It hit me hard, but now I can see how lucky I was. I had him long enough to learn all about how to live near and with the land. He taught me carpentry, hunting, fishing, and all kinds of things that lots of girls rarely get a chance to learn. In the spring and fall, he'd always take a week and go out into the woods and just live there. All three of us would. We'd bring about half enough food and try to make up for the rest ourselves. Depending on the season, there were mushrooms, berries, cattails, pawpaws to collect. Dad could always sniff out a good fishing hole, too. Mom was a great camp cook. She'd usually sneak a few things from the garden into her pack. Onions and garlic scrapes, peppers, and the like. It's kinds of things that make whatever it is you're cooking smell and taste good. Dad and I would bring back fish. Mom would throw some butter in the pan, and next thing you know, the forest would smell like caramelizing peppers and garlic. We never saw her pack the good stuff, never saw her chop it, and it would just suddenly be there. We always kind of suspected witchcraft. We'd settle in with full bellies, and Dad would tell stories about strange sounds in the woods, weeping and moaning, monsters crashing through the underbrush, missing people, and the occasional scrapes left on car doors. The good stuff, I'd say. I'd get good and scared and snuggle in between them while I was still young enough to do so. I miss my dad, but it's easy to see him in all the things I do and love. There was a couple, Reggie and Laura, who lived not far away. We were neighbors, but we had 15 acres, and they had 25, so you usually had to put effort into seeing them. When Dad died, Richie took me out in the woods and showed me the most magical place I'd ever seen. It was a clearing less than a mile from our house, but it was surrounded by some pretty intimidating-looking hollers, so if you didn't know where the pass was, you'd never find it. Reggie knew where the pass was, and after that, so did I. The sun would shine in like a ray of gold, and there was a single flat boulder in the middle that you could use as a seat or a table. In the early summer, it would fill up with pink and purple spring cress, and the tree line would be ringed with toothwort flowers, all nodding and mournful. The real show came later in the summer, around July, when the feather bells would light up the tree line like a wildfire. They grow like long grasses, with a line of bright red flowers licking at the air all along the tops of them. I'd sprawl out over the boulder, feel the warmth of the sun, surrounded by those fiery extravagances of feather bells, and soak it all in. I could feel the energy of the place coursing through me. It felt connected, honest, true. It was a place of great solace for me. I'd hack out along the creek and collect some of the wisteria, then head to the pass and spend the rest of the day weaving them into baskets on my shoulder. Still soaking up the energy of the forest, Mom would occasionally come out to check on me, bring me sandwiches and the like. "This is a place of longing," she said once. "It was longing that drew your dad here in the first place. It's part of the ecosystem here." I gave her that look that teenagers give their mom when she doesn't really get it and wants to be left alone. All I'm saying is, don't get lost in it. That longing will eat you alive if you let it. If it starts getting to you, just head back to the house. I'll make a nice pie for you. "I love you, sweetheart." She gave me a big hug when she said it. Once I had a good-sized basket, I went into the woods and filled it with all of Dad's favorite things, and buried it there with me. It took me all summer, but by the time I was through, I felt more connected to my dad and to the forest than I ever had. During my senior year, Laura died of cancer. I brought Reggie out to the clearing with some wisteria and a pack of food. I told him about the basket I made when Dad died and that I'd stay out here for as long as he needed it. He was thankful. It was the last time I saw him. Mom figured he just couldn't handle being reminded of Laura and moved away. But there were rumors that he went out to the forest and just never came back. There were a couple of good years where I was always a little nervous that I'd find what was left of him during a hike. That faded with time, and I accepted that Mom was probably right. She usually was. I got a job doing carpentry after graduation and got an apartment in town. I loved my newfound freedom, being able to have boys over whenever I wanted, cook what I wanted, watch what I wanted. Every weekend, I'd go back to the house, back to my clearing. I'd get to feeling weird and itchy if I was gone for too long, like something wasn't right. There's a disconnect that happens when you live around people, like you start to forget what's real. You start thinking that social reality is reality, that rumors and gossip and bullying and politics are real. But you can't put any of those things in your belly or rub it between your fingers to get the scent of it. Real is a rock in a clearing where I can eat pawpaws and smell the autumn leaves quickly on the way back to the soil. Real is the electric crackling of the leaves raining down and the fiery blossoms of the feather bells. All that other stuff, that's just people trying to get you to do things they want. I was 24 and sitting on the boulder reading a book when I first noticed the hollow place in the tree line. First I thought maybe a deer had come through and taken out the flowers in that area, but I just couldn't ignore it. Something about it just felt not good, but still welcoming. I could feel a wanting in my chest, a pull of uncertainty. I looked all around the path for signs of what made it. There were no tracks, no footprints, nothing, just an opening. It was damp and dark, like the bottom of a holler. The trees leaned over it and filled in the canopy so much that you couldn't see more than 10 feet down the path. It just dissolved into nothingness. The scent of decaying leaves came out of it. Being where it was at the time of the year, it should have been drying out and smelling of greenery. This smelled like autumn rain, toads, night crawlers. It felt like the wrong home. Like when your neighbor is moving and you get a peek at their apartment and it's just like yours, but it's just empty and wrong. The path was empty and wrong too, and I wanted it, and it frightened me. I must have spent an hour or more scouting around the path. I'd dig through the forest on either side of it until I hit the edge of the holler, then go back. I'd toss rocks and sticks into the darkness and watch them dissolve away. I turned on my phone's flashlight and held my arm out as far as I could, but I saw nothing. The sun started to dip, and I resolved to come back another day. I was back the next weekend. The path sat there staring at me. I had almost forgotten about it, but there it was, and I was filled with a hollow wanting. I sat my phone and collection of weaving materials on the boulder and approached the opening. Nothing. Just a big open maw. I could hear the silence seeping out of that place. I just stood there, staring, wondering, wanting. Curiosity got the better of me, and I moved into the path to fill the nothingness. It was dark. I mean, more than it should have been. At 20 feet in, I could no longer see the tops of the trees, the start of the path, or where it led to. I expected to run into the holler that surrounded the place in no time, but I just kind of kept on moving. The holler never showed up. The quiet of the place put me on my nerves. Forests have a life of their own. The breath of the wind and wings flowing through the trees, the pulse of insects and wildlife pushing through the underbrush. A real vitality. That was muted here, like when you're wearing a good pair of headphones with the sound off. It's all just turned down and filled with cotton. Cotton, darkness, and the smell of night crawlers. I turned the corner and found the biggest patch of jack-o'-lantern mushrooms I'd ever seen. It was beautiful, easily 3 feet in diameter, and crawling a foot up the side of an old stump. At night, I bet you could see them glow from 100 feet away. I stepped over carefully to check them out. You can't eat them, but let me tell you, they're a sight to behold. I wanted to behold some sights at that point. It seemed like a little fairy city. Stems led to caps, next to more stems, thick enough you couldn't see anything past them. I moved all around them, just taking it in from all sides, when something caught my eye on the forest floor. Something smooth and regular in a sea of irregularity. Man-made things stick out here. I got down and dug at the forest floor a bit and pulled out a watch. It was a nice one by the look of it. Looked like it had been there for a while. I brushed the dirt off and saw the inscription on the back. For Reggie, my beloved. My heart sank. Jack-o'-lanterns grow on trees, not people, so I wasn't worried that I'd find him, but finding his watch way out here wasn't a good sign. I felt a pang of guilt. I pocketed the watch and moved back to the path, thinking I should go let someone know. There's plenty of time to explore here later. I was filled with a deep longing, a hollowed-out desire, and I stood there, fumbling with the watch in my pocket, lost in it all. The darkness, the dampness, and the bright orange of the mushrooms. I remember my dad, Laura, Reggie, my mom, all the people who made me who I am. Reality came back in a huge crash from behind me, like a wave of trees falling in my direction. Something massive was in the woods, smashing aggressively up the trail I had just come down. I took off running the other way. Whatever it was, I wanted some distance between us. I got a couple of 100 feet down the trail and stopped. I didn't like the idea of trying to hide in a part of the forest that was new to me. Maybe I avoided the animals, but I didn't want to do so at the cost of getting lost. I stood still, leaned against a tree, and just listened. We don't get big animals here. Deer are by far the biggest, but that's it. And I know that a deer running through the forest sounds different than that. There's been some talk of buffalo, bear, mountain lions coming back to the area, but nobody has seen any of them around here. I had no idea what that could have been, but I wanted to go back home. Dad would have known. He'll tell me what it was and how to handle it, calm me down, and get me home. I caught a flash of movement at the edge of my vision, just a bit too far into the darkness to see. It sounded big, but it was moving slow now. I felt the gnawing at my chest, a pulling, wanting, that hollow desire. I sat quiet and listened to it, trying to figure out what it was, where it was coming from, where it was going, waiting and listening for my chance to get past it, to get home. More movement, a quiet rustle in the underbrush. A shape came out of the darkness, dark and thin, wobbling slowly down the path. It coalesced into a definitive shape of a man, thin and gaunt and filthy. It was Reggie. He had been out here all these years, his hair and beard grown out in a brittle frizz. "Reggie!" I shouted. "Oh, Amy, what are you doing here? Why are you here? I'm so sorry. You can't be here. It's not safe." "What are you talking about? I've been out here my whole life. Where have you been? We need to get back. You don't look well. What have you been eating and drinking? I can't, he said. I can't go back. I belong to it now. I can't go home. What do you mean? That thing in the woods? It's probably just a really big deer and probably more afraid of us than we are of it. I was channeling my dad perfectly. He was so good in situations like this. It's not an animal, Amy. It's not anything you may have known about. I feel it. I feel it inside me. I feel it clawing at me. I can't let you end up like me. You gotta leave, he said. I'm not leaving without you. You're unwell. I grabbed his arm and started pulling him down the path, back towards home. That's when I felt it. The hollow wanting, the need, it stopped me in my tracks. Reggie twisted out of my grip and pushed me away, whispering in earnest, You have to go now. I stumbled forward into the darkness with a crash resounding behind me, coming on quickly. I slipped behind a rock to hide, poking my head out to see Reggie disappear down the path into the darkness, holding his hands up and calling, I'm here! I'm here! The crashing slowed just on the edge of the darkness that I could see. Its body looked like a tube of smooth mottled skin, a snake without scales, twice the thickness of the biggest tree I'd ever seen. It undulated through the air, belly barely scraping the top of the soil. Then a shoulder emerged, and a hand reached out of the darkness, grasping at the air. Dirt and grime mixed with a shiny ooze, getting squeezed and mixed together in the cracks of its knuckles. Thick mud caked the underside of its fingernails. The hand searched around in the air before landing on the ground and pushing the body forward and around the back into the darkness. Shortly after, another arm emerged from that blackness, repeating the process. Then a thick tail whipped out and around, smashing into a tree along the way. The longing raged inside me as Reggie led it back into the darkness. I ran, and I kept running through the leaves and the branches until I couldn't run anymore. I found a good tree, and I leaned against it out of view. I could still hear the thing shambling around behind me, slow and aimless now. Reggie must have distracted it. I sank down to the ground to catch my breath. It had definitely not been a deer. I sat there for a few minutes, letting my heart slow down, waiting for a calm so I could think this thing through. I can't keep going in this direction. I could probably just run a straight line back. The path wasn't terribly twisty, or if I could find a holler, I could probably follow it back around to the clearing. If that thing sticks to the path, that might be the safest route. Slower, but safer. That only works if it's the same holler. I could end up just getting lost, which would probably be worse. Straight back is probably safer. If I ran as fast as I could probably be in the clear pretty fast. A dull throbbing started up my feet. They pulsed, hot from running. I shifted back and forth a bit to let them calm down, and the ground shifted back. I looked down, and there were night crawlers everywhere, gnawing at the trees and leaves and wrapping around my shoes. All was moving back up the path. Then I felt it too, the deep, gnawing desire. I could feel it in my heart. I felt it, a wanting, a longing. I knew what was coming, but I needed to look anyway. My eyes followed the trail of night crawlers back up the path. The head of the thing emerged from the darkness, broad and flat, pushed forward by enormous muscular arms. With every step, its hands reached out, grasping the air. My heart filled with need and want, an emptiness crying out, a desire ringed with crackled burnt edges. Reggie laid in its mouth, legs dangling from side to side, arms and head from the other. Long strings of saliva dripped around him, mixing with the mud and calling to the night crawlers. He turned his head, and I caught his eye. Sadness washed over him, and he whispered, "Run!" I did. I ran right past them both. The wanting burned at my skin and hollowed me out as I passed inches away. Every part of me sang the aberration of giving in, and I have never wanted more. But my feet kept going, and in time, so did I. With the creature behind me, I kept crashing down the path, my every nerve lit up with that hollow need. I crashed out to the clearing, over the pass, and back to the yard where Mom was waiting. A fresh pie, just out of the oven. It all started when I went to get some hair product I ordered at my barber shop. You can't get it anywhere else. The owner of the shop is Terry, a sweet, or so I thought, elderly man who owned the shop for 40 years. It was usually only him working there, along with a few odd others that came and went. I'd been going there ever since I moved to town a few years back. He always gave me the best haircuts. When I arrived to pick up my stuff, I saw that he wasn't in his usual post, sitting in a chair at the register. Instead, I saw a silhouette in the back room behind a curtain. I heard some pretty unsettling choking noises coming from behind that curtain, too. I thought Terry might have been choking, so my hero instinct kicked in, and I rushed to the back room to assist with what I thought was a choking Terry. As I was about to pull the curtain back, Terry came out at an extreme speed and said he was choking on a sandwich for a second, but it had come back up. I felt relieved, but also a little confused. Terry looked frazzled, unkempt, sweaty, like he had just gotten in a fight or been lost in the forest for a couple of days. He brushed it off and gave me my hair product. He also threw in a shampoo, which was enjoyable, until it felt like Terry was digging into my scalp really hard with long, sharp nails. When I went home, I checked in the mirror to see if Terry had done any damage, and sure enough, there were quite a few scratches. They were almost like cat scratches, but nothing too major. I doused the top of my head with isopropyl alcohol, and it burned like hell. I hoped that I didn't have any infection from that old man. I processed the strange occurrence at the barber shop as I drifted off to sleep that night. The second occurrence is when things started to get really strange. It was my next appointment at the shop, about a few weeks after my previous appointment to grab some hair product. I came in expecting Terry to be at his usual spot, but once again he was absent. I noticed there was no one else in the shop, except for Terry, sitting on one of the chairs, looking into the mirror with a maniacal look on his face. I went up to him and called his name to try to get his attention. He didn't move. I put my hand on his shoulder and looked closely at his face, his eyes looking bloodshot and his pupils extremely dilated. I shuddered as I looked at him. Soon after I put my hand on him, he suddenly lunged out of the chair towards me, knocking me to the floor. He almost had me pinned to the ground. His eyes were murderous, and his smile was even bigger as he brought a pair of scissors from his hand and put them close to my neck. Then suddenly he froze, and I too was frozen in sheer terror. I was stuck there for a bit, staring into the lifeless eyes of this old fella that I'd really come to like. After I finally came to my senses, Terry was still just frozen over the top of me. I got out from under him and ran as fast as I could for the door. After I got home that day, I was high-strung. I was cursing, throwing things across the house, and pacing back and forth for hours. What in the hell should I do? I asked myself. The cops really wouldn't believe that a sweet old man, always kind, smiling, and telling stories while he cut your hair, would act like Chucky from Child's Play. Hell, most of the police force probably got their hair cut by him, as there were only 3 barbershops that I knew of in town. Then the thought of a paranormal experience popped into my head. This isn't a movie. There's no way that can actually happen. Maybe he had gone senile. His brain had rotten, and he had gone mad. I tried to stop myself thinking about Terry's delirious behavior, and finally got to bed. I ended up doing it anyway. I phoned the police the next day and told them the gist of what had happened, how Terry had tried to assault me with a pair of scissors. They had me come down to the shop for their investigation, because I was the only witness. When I got there, I told them in great detail what had happened the day before, When I finished the story, I could tell that they didn't really believe me. Terry was the only one at the shop when the police arrived, and he seemed to be back to his usual sweet old man self, contrary to the demon I had encountered just the day before. For the safety of the public, I had them try and get a search warrant for the shop. I mainly just wanted them to search the back room, where I'd heard that odd noise. They succeeded and searched the shop, but they ended up finding nothing incriminating, even in that back room. I had figured that would happen. They wouldn't find any dirt on Terry, and I would likely look like a suspicious fool. Bringing the police into this probably just further influenced Terry's unprompted rage against me. I wondered if when I heard those noises from the back room and went to investigate, maybe I saw or heard something I wasn't supposed to. When it was all said and done in the shop, I was in an interview with the police again. I abruptly felt the piercing gaze of something and averted my eyes from the officer. Standing in the shop window was Terry, his pupils the size of dimes and an unnatural cannibalistic grin on his face. It made me let out a shriek, and the officer looked at me concerned. "You all right, son?" "Yeah, just a sharp pain in my leg." My eyes again drifted back to the spot where Terry had been standing, but he was no longer there. The officer then looked to where I was looking. "What you looking at, kid?" "Nothing. I thought I saw a reflection or something, but it's not there anymore." I wrapped up the interview as quickly as possible, as I knew it was a waste of time. At that point, I knew that Terry wanted to settle this man-to-man. I was going to have to take matters into my own hands, it appeared. I went home and began planning, trying to build up the strength to go back to the barbershop from hell. When I was finally ready, I grabbed a camera for capturing evidence and a knife for self-protection. I didn't want to bring anything else as to remain a little inconspicuous. I went late at night, as I had the feeling that Terry knew I was coming. He would leave the door unlocked for me. I knew now that whatever Terry was, he sure wasn't human, or at least he wasn't anymore. When I arrived at the shop, my intuition proved correct. The door was indeed unlocked. As I entered, I suddenly wondered what had happened to that sweet old man who used to cut my hair. What had happened to him? Was he faking it all along, or had something done away with the kind old man I remembered? I quickly brushed the thought away when I saw the shop was pitch black, except for a faint, glimmering light coming from behind the curtain leading to the back room. I regretted not bringing a flashlight. The atmosphere was eerie, and it gave me the chills. I slowly walked to the red curtain, expecting something wicked on the other side. I cringed as I quickly pulled it aside, but there was nothing. The lone light source was coming from a few candles on a table, melted wax all over it. I began searching in the back area. It had a wooden floor with a couple of stalls, dirty rags and hair scattered all across the floor. After searching for a few minutes and finding nothing, I was starting to think about calling it quits, which, looking back now, I really should have done. I was on my way out when I suddenly heard a faint banging noise. As I went to investigate, I found that the noise was coming from the floor of one of the stalls. I kicked the dirty rags and hair covering the floor aside and lifted up a rug. Underneath it was a small trap door, cut to look flush with the floor. "Wonder how the police didn't find that," I said, and snapped a picture. I lifted up the hatch to find a narrow, dark pit staring back at me, the only way down being a rickety ladder. As I descended the ladder, I realized it was taking quite a long time. I wondered how Terry, or whoever made this place, had managed to dig this pit so deep underground. As I continued thinking, I was interrupted by my feet hitting the ground. I turned around and was met with an almost pitch-black hallway, the only light being let in through the window of an industrial steel door at the end of the hall. As I made my way down the hall and reached the door, I braced myself, took a deep breath, and quickly entered, my soul freezing. It was like a butcher's shop. Dried blood covered the steel walls and the tile floor. There were 2 tables on either side of the room, covered in blood, hair, and gobbets of some animal. I started frantically taking pictures, trying to fight the sheer terror and shiver I was experiencing. After a few minutes, I heard the motor turn on. There was a conveyor belt system on the ceiling, like one of those you'd find in a dry cleaner. They were both moving. This alarmed me, and I put away the camera and drew my knife. After a short while, clothing began coming out of the conveyor system behind the wall. At first, they just looked like poorly made furs, but upon closer inspection, they were definitely not furs. They appeared dried with blood. The fur had been sewn into splotches, as you could see the hide underneath. I spotted a nipple on one of them and was revolted. That's when I realized that these coats were made not from animals, but from humans. The fur on the coats was human hair, and the hide was the skin from a torso. That's when I let out the shrillest scream I had probably ever made. I became frantic, and I was running to the exit. I slipped in a pool of fresh blood and dropped my knife. As I stumbled, trying to get myself back up, I heard the door that was on the other side of the room open, my scream probably alerting whatever was coming. When I thought my heart couldn't go any faster, I saw what was coming through that door. It looked like Terry, judging by the uniform it had on. It had a mask made of hair, with bloody teeth lining the mouth hole. It was armed with a pair of massive shears in one hand, and a straight razor in the other. We stood still and looked at each other for a second. I was freaking out at that point and was frozen in place. I wanted to leave as fast as I could, but my body just wouldn't move. Then the thing started sprinting towards me, and my adrenaline must have really kicked in, because I got up and ran faster than I had ever run in my life. I got to the other side of the steel door I came through and slammed it before the thing could get to it. I bolted down the hallway and started climbing the ladder, afraid it would break with the speed with which I was climbing. I could hear that thing breaking down the door that I had slammed in its face. Finally, I reached the top and threw down the hatch of the trapdoor. I moved a cabinet that was on one of the stalls to the top of the trapdoor and hopefully trapped whatever it was down there. I ran out of that shop in a dazed frenzy. I kept running until I reached home. I passed out that night, and the first thing I did when I woke up was call the police. I still sounded panicked then and could barely begin to explain what was going on. The police sounded confused, saying, "There's no barbershop in town that's owned by someone named Terry." I thought they were playing some sick joke, and I got furious with them. I convinced them to launch another investigation at that address, and they decided to meet me there. When I got there, my mouth was agape. There was no barbershop sign, nothing inside the shop, and certainly no Terry. The place looked like it had been abandoned for decades. I felt like I was going insane, and I bet the cops also thought I was a loony. I didn't even want to try to explain to them what had happened, because they seemed absolutely oblivious to it. I then remembered that I had the camera with the photos, and decided to show that to them. They took it into evidence and had the film developed. The film, however, had somehow been exposed to sunlight, and the pictures didn't show up. Even though I had bought the film the day before I went to the shop that night, the police wrote me off as some paranoid lunatic and thought nothing of the whole thing. That was almost 5 years ago. I've moved back to my hometown, trying to escape the torment of being in that place, where I almost lost my life in that barbershop from hell. What's making me write this, however, is that I received a letter in my mailbox today. "Hey Mike, it's Terry. I sure do miss you. When's your next appointment? I really look forward to seeing you again." It was sent from a Terry's barbershop, with an address in my current town. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thanks so much for joining me for tonight's story. I hope you enjoyed tonight's tale by Jankycranky, and I hope you'll go look at their other work. They have some other things that look pretty interesting, and I'm certain this won't be the last story we hear of theirs on this channel. You can follow the links below if you're interested in their other work, but before we leave, let's go ahead and thank our patrons. Thanks to the Irish Devil for being our Spooky Ghost contributor. Thanks to Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. Thanks to Leslie Lou Riddle, Emily Coltsfoot, and Xaronan for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. And thanks to Glenn Jenkins for being our Ghostwriter tier contributor. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you too would like to support the show, then come on down to Patreon. For just $5 a month, you too can have your name read out at the end of every TikTok and every YouTube video that I do. $5 patrons at our Spooky Skeleton tier also get their spooky a day early, on a Tuesday and a Thursday. Patrons can also suggest stories for my Monday readings, so what are you waiting for? Come on down and have a look. If you enjoyed today's story, why not subscribe? Maybe hit that notification bell. And of course, come on by and leave me a comment. The algorithm, and me of course, always like it when people come by and say hi. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening. Imaginary friends. We've all had them. Oh sure, we all get the occasional creepypasta about them. But, at worst, they're just a symptom of treatable mental illness. They're never actually real. And yet, right now, I'm not so sure. I don't know if it was my daughter's imaginary friend that did this to her, but what happened to my daughter, only 2 weeks ago no less, was a horrific tragedy, and I don't think the imaginary friend she had before was completely non-compliant in it. Okay, let's start at the beginning. I used to be just a normal mom. My name's Ella. My daughter, Susan, is 5. Now, she'll be 5 forever. Off topic there. Susan used to go to kindergarten outside town. We live in Blackthorn, Ohio. Her teacher, Miss Adina, actually lived 2 doors down from us, and she'd been nothing but an angel to me and my Susan, especially during this awful time. Honestly, don't know what I would do without that wonderful woman. But it was during her kindergarten that the fiasco started. I came to pick her up, and she told me she'd made a friend at school. Oh, really? What's their name? Thelma, she said cheerfully. She's invisible and lives in a giant playground world full of stars she created. At this point, I, of course, figured Thelma was imaginary. She sounds wonderful, I said. She is. Miss Adina told me to stay back and clean the toy corner during break time. At first I thought it would be boring, but then Thelma showed up and magically cleaned it, and we spent the rest of break time playing together. Susan always had such an imagination, and she was such a big talker. On the ride home, Susan described her new friend's appearance. She's black all over, and her clothes and hair are too. She's got little white dots sparkling all over her, and she says she's 7 years old. I thought it was just adorable at the time. That night, Susan came to me saying that Thelma would be staying at our house for the week, and she would be playing with her. Oh, okay, I said again, with an amused smile. The next day, Susan came home with another story about Thelma. She opened up a way to her world during break time, and we played in there all day. She said soon she's going to let me stay forever. At this point, I got mildly concerned. Susan, Thelma's imaginary. You know that, right? Susan just giggled. No, she's not. She's sitting next to me in the car right now. And she pointed at an empty seat next to her. I was relieved to know that this wasn't anyone grooming Susan at school, but I was mildly concerned for her psyche at this point. But through mental gymnastics, I erased my worries. She's just pretending, I said to myself. Lots of kids have imaginary friends at her age. She'll get over it. She's not insane. It's probably just me. And maybe I was. I know that I'm probably insane now. Susan came home from school the next day with a concerned look on her face. Thelma doesn't like you, she said in the car. She says you're boring and always telling me what to do, and she hates that. That night, there were more mental gymnastics on my part. Thelma isn't real. Thelma isn't real, I repeated to myself over and over again. For the next few days, until the end of the week, it was normal. Susan coming home from school each day with a new story about what she and Thelma did together that day. Until Sunday. On Sunday morning, Susan told me that Thelma was going to take her to her world tonight. I didn't respond. It was an odd combination of scared, in denial, and angry at myself for being worried about this. It's just an imaginary friend. Just an imaginary friend. Just an imaginary friend. On Monday morning, I woke up, but I couldn't find Susan anywhere. The police were called, but they didn't find her either. I was hating myself, while at the same time trying to reassure myself that it wasn't Thelma who had done this. And yet, just last week, the police found Susan's body. She was discovered in a tree in the forest in our town, with 7 different stab wounds and a terrified expression on her face. Now I don't know whether it really was someone grooming her, whether someone else was in on the act, or whether it was something else entirely. If anyone knows anything about Susan or Thelma, please tell me. I need to know, and I need to know now. I don't know where to start this. It's hard to really put it into words just how shocking this event has come off to me. I guess the best place to start would be to explain what happened. When I was around 10, I had a loving dog named Jocko. He was a husky, and we would go for walks almost every day. One day, however, his rope snapped. He must have seen a squirrel or another small animal and ran off into the woods to chase it. I remember running home in hysterics and explaining what had happened to Dad. He yelled at me, but eventually he went out to his truck and went to go find him. He was gone for about 5 hours, and when he came back, I could tell from his red face and his angered expression that he hadn't found Jocko. Even though I could tell he wasn't coming home, I attempted to ask him if he found my loving dog. "Dad, did you find Jack?" I was immediately slapped in the face and sent off to my room to bed. I was crying into my pillow all night. Jocko was an amazing dog. I'd never loved something more until the night he ran off. I remember his bright red collar with a brass pendant labeled J.O. It had a little dog paw print above his initials. Fast forward to now, I'm 55 years old, and I've been working as a dentist for the last 21 years. I was going outside to collect the mail when I heard the sound of barking and twigs snapping. That was when I remembered Jocko. God, it had been so long since I thought of him. My heart was aching as I went inside and read through my mail. I spoke to myself as I went through all of it. Bill, more bills. Finally, the last envelope revealed itself. The paper was trimmed yellow, clearly signifying how old it was. It had an old red wax stamp that had been burdened with time. It was slightly chipped. I read the date on the envelope, 1978. I was confused. I decided to open it and was amazed to find a letter from my grandpa. Grandpa had died long ago when I was about 17. When I read the letter, each sentence made me feel more like crying than the last. "Hey, Felix. I'm really sorry about Jocko. He was a good boy. I'm sure he'll come back to you someday. He's probably out there chasing squirrels. I hope this letter reaches you and doesn't get stuck in processing or any of that. Sincerely, Grandpa." The last sentence broke the somber mood as I chuckled to myself. The irony of the situation, lightening my day as I started to get ready for work. I checked my phone, 6:34 a.m. I had work in about half an hour, so I went to get some coffee ready while I went to the bedroom. As I walked into my room, I was greeted with a sight that made me feel at home. My bedroom reminded me of my childhood. The ugly old wallpaper, the yellow-stained tiles, the amazing smell of mustiness greeting me like a warm embrace. I was happy here. As I was getting ready, I heard more barking. I recognized it. I couldn't pinpoint how exactly, but something about it was familiar. As I finally walked out of my bedroom, I stopped in my tracks. I realized what it was and recognized the sound. It was Jocko. It was the same high-pitched, mellow bark that I recognized from my childhood. I immediately rushed out my door. I ran to the back of the house. I frantically rounded the corner to see my childhood best friend lying in the dirt. Immediately, two details popped into my head, which made me happy and confused. I had moved around 700 miles away from my childhood home. And two was, when Jocko ran off, he was around 5 years old. Dogs don't live that long, I thought. Maybe this was a different dog that sounded and looked like Jocko. That thought was immediately disproven as I noticed the bright red collar and the brass pendant around his neck. I ran up to him, and he didn't even seem fazed. He started to groan as I looked at the pendant. The initials read J.O. My hands were shaking so violently, it looked like I was having a seizure. I immediately embraced my long-lost best friend, but something felt wrong. He was way too cold, even for the early morning weather. I sort of flinched, but I didn't care. I hugged him so tightly, I felt my body ache. Finally, I got up and let him inside. He moved weirdly, almost like he was drunk. I chalked it up to his extreme old age, but I noticed how the collar seemed pristine. I immediately called into work and explained how I wasn't going to make it because I wasn't feeling good. As I stood there on the phone, I noticed how my dog kept on bumping into things. Again, I thought it was old age. I couldn't believe I'd found Jocko after all these years anyway. The sleepless nights I had endured over his disappearance. I couldn't help but tear up as I hugged him again. That's when I noticed. Jocko's eyes had turned a brown color. I very vividly remembered him having sapphire blue eyes. In fact, it was such a prominent feature that we nicknamed him Bluey at the time. I was shocked. I didn't know how to react. My emotions were a mixture of curiosity, confusion, and fear. I sort of just stared at him as I analyzed his face. Everything about it seemed crooked. It was like he had slowly morphed. I noticed patches of dark fur I hadn't seen before. His snout seemed more jagged, but the biggest detail was his teeth. They seemed way too sharp and narrow for a dog. I hadn't even seen that in wolves. I sort of pondered as I went to get him food and water. Everything raced through my mind at once. Thoughts like, that's not your dog, or how did he get here? I was so confused. I felt almost dazed as I brought the dish of foul-smelling dog food and tap water to Jocko. I sat it down and watched as his previously sloppy demeanor changed into a fast, focused strut. He elegantly waltzed over to his meal and proceeded to devour it within seconds. "Must be hungry, huh, Jock?" I said sarcastically. That joking mood changed into something serious as he glanced from his food and stared right at me. He was looking into my eyes as I glanced at him. As odd as it sounds, his eyes seemed human. I can't properly put it into words. I looked at him, but right as I was about to look away, he groaned at me. Now I swear to you guys, I heard the word help come from that groan. It was like a whisper traveling into the room. I immediately felt sick as I backed away. I don't understand why I decided to do what I did next, but some people make mistakes in a moment of quick thought. I decided to keep Jocko with me. I thought, all of this is just stress. None of this is serious. You probably just heard something. I really had no clue what was about to happen, though. Because I didn't have work that afternoon, I decided that finishing up my basement would be a great idea. I'd been working on this thing for 5 months, and it was a perfect man cave. Hardwood floors, a massive TV, felt like a perfect hangout place for someone like me. I even had a vintage Atari sitting there to relive my childhood passions. As I slowly crept down the steps, each creak and groan and crack making me feel nervous. I was still quite shaken up from Jocko's sudden appearance, and I had to think for a good minute about what to do. You obviously can't just take in an enormous husky after years and years of not owning a dog. I started to remember how long it had been since I'd seen him last. 1978? That was simply not possible. It was 2023, and that meant that Jocko would be 50 years old. I started to think, what if this was a completely different dog I just brought in? What if he's completely rabid? I started to worry as I shifted damp cardboard boxes in the basement. Each shift made me flinch as I heard the familiar sound of paws stomping on hardwood. I listened as Jocko slowly walked down the wooden stairs. I turned around to see him. His tongue was hanging out. I saw black viscous liquid on his tongue, and I almost gagged. The room was filled up with a pungent odor. Think of roadkill that's been left to rot in the sun. I started to gag even harder as I watched Jocko take very slow steps towards me. It reminded me of a wolf silently approaching its prey. Then I saw the collar, and all previous thoughts of this being a different dog were wiped away. In awe, I watched as he drove me into a corner. Jocko, calm down, boy. It's me. It's Felix. I watched as he perked his head to the side. His ears twitched. "That's a good boy." Every word I spoke felt like a challenge. It was actually hard to think. I was so worried about him going crazy, I didn't even notice the silence. There were no more birds fluttering or calling. No more insects or bees. Hell, not even the wind was swaying. It felt hopeless. I didn't know why I dismissed the smell or the black liquid that was on my once beloved dog's tongue. I was just worried about being bitten. I stretched my hand after a bout of thought and began to slowly stroke him. Even though he was clearly old and he'd been outside for decades, his fur still felt the same. It was incredibly smooth. It felt like silk was caressing my hands. I watched as he began to calm down. I finally walked past him and led him up the stairs. I was contemplating calling a vet. After a few minutes of thinking, I decided that it was for the best. Hell, what if Jocko had rabies and he bit me? I shook the thought off and rang up our local vet. After a few minutes of discussing, we decided on an appointment for tomorrow. I sighed. Even a day with Jocko felt like torture. I was actually surprised. After so many years of missing and begging for my dog to come back, I was now contemplating making him go away. Eventually, it fell dark, and the feeling of tiredness swiftly overtook me. I got ready for bed and decided to check up on Jocko before I went to sleep. As I quietly tiptoed down the stairs, each step making me feel more on edge, that was when I heard a very distinct sound. It was like something wet slapping a hard surface. I could hear the echoes. It was coming from the basement. I felt a sense of dread deep in my stomach as I slowly rummaged to find the door to my basement. I noticed something. The door was wide open. I very slowly began to make my way down the stairs. Every hair on my body started to stand up as I made it to the halfway point. It was cold. I felt my body begin to shake violently as the sound got louder and louder. It was reducing my mind to rubble as I finally made it down. What stood in the corner of my basement was something that would haunt me, even as I lost my memories. Jocko stood there silently on his hind legs. He had something in his mouth. The moon illuminated him through the basement window, and it revealed the blood dripping from his teeth. Finally, I realized what it was. It was the collar of my dog. It had been ripped off of him and still had clumps of fur and parts of it on his neck. It had blood staining it. I immediately looked at this thing's neck and came to a horrible realization. That same collar was on its neck. This was not my dog that stood before me. I let out a yelp, and suddenly there was silence. My mind felt frozen as this thing turned around to see me. Its face was so horribly mangled I could see little bits of mange littering its face like spots of paint. Its eyes were black. I could see my own reflection in them, like a mirror. Then I watched as it dropped the collar, and now presumably my dead dog, as it slowly approached me. It walked like a human. I finally found the courage to get away as I ran. As I made it up the stairs and out the door, that thing chased after me. It slammed into my glass sliding door, making it shatter. It let out a horrible yelp. It stood between me and the only place I could now use as an escape. I did the only thing I could think to do. I ran up the stairs and went into my room. I slammed the door shut and locked it as I began to barricade myself with loose furniture. I ran over to my phone and dialed 911, the feeling of hopelessness and sorrow only slightly fading away as the feeling of another person speaking to me came on the line. 911, what's your emergency? Listen, my dog's gone crazy. I'm in my room right now trying to keep it away. It's somewhere in my house. I don't know where. Please just send help. I heard the sound of shuffling on the other end of the line. All right, sir. Make sure to stay on the line and keep out of sight, okay? Everything's going to be okay. What's your address? The sound of horrible screaming and rummaging began to litter the air like a pathogen as I continued. 178 Mangrove Drive. Please send help. I don't know how much longer I can bear this. That's when I looked out the window. I saw the face of my dog looking at me. I lost my breath almost immediately. Its face began to warp into a human. Its skin was white. It smiled at me. How was it this tall? Oh God, my dog's looking at me. It wants to kill me. Please send help. Oh my God. I told these things to the operator as I stared back at the thing. It put its unnaturally slender hand up to its mouth and made a shushing gesture. I screamed, but it didn't last long as I felt the elevating sounds of this thing's horrible chuckle. I felt so alone. It kept on looking at me with its horrible grin, its smile so large as it stretched beyond my window. Then it showed me something that has me crying while I write this. I watched in terror as its hands reached down and pulled something off the ground. It began to pull up a gray fur-covered body. It was Jocko. I could see the red collar on its decapitated body. I began to cry maniacally. Why was this happening? Was this all a dream? Sir, we're 2 minutes away. Hang in there. The voice on the line echoed as a feeling of hope began to fill my body. Something that quickly faded as the thing began to put its hand to my window. I watched as it began to feel around before finally pulling it open. The squeal of the window finally reached the top, and I began to sob. I was ready to accept death. It took the body of my mangled dog and threw it into the room. It landed at my feet, the blood pooling the carpet, making it look like red wine had spilled everywhere. I began to embrace my long-gone friend in my lap as I watched the thing smile at me. I heard it stomp as it began to walk away. I didn't care for my life anymore. I sat there crying and hugging my dead best friend. Jocko, no, I quietly uttered as I held him in my lap. I heard the fading sounds of sirens began to approach as I sat there with my dog. The rest of it's a blur. I woke up in the hospital. I don't know how, but I'd cuts littered all over my body. I thought it was from me hurrying to barricade my door, or the glass from the initial impact of that thing slamming into my sliding door. It's been 2 days now. I'm still in the hospital. I don't know what's happening. My house is being investigated. I might be sent to jail under suspicion of animal abuse and neglect, but I'm not so sure. I love you, Jocko. I wish you'd never ran away. I have 2 problems that I'm always a little embarrassed to admit to, because there's always those who believe neither to be the real problem. The first problem is that I've had no long-term relationships in a long time. The second is that my house is haunted. Cue people lecturing me about priorities and handing me unsolicited life advice. I mention these things more to explain how the third of the 5 entities came to join my house. This was coming to a year of me living at the house. By that time, I'd set up a working, if not uncomfortable, relationship with the 2 entities. Knox, the first entity you might remember, communicates by creaking the house. 1 for yes, 2 for no. If I enter a room and I hear 2 knocks, I leave and return later. Other than that, communication between the 2 of us is seldom. The second entity lives in the basement and is appeased by milk and bread that I leave out every night. Truth be told, I don't know what guarantees my offerings confer upon me. I know it wanders around the house some nights, in some form. Because of that, I only leave my bedroom out of absolute necessity once it's dark. It has left me mostly unmolested in the sanctuary of my bedroom. Perhaps that's because I have left a line of iron dust along the threshold every night. It's surprising how quickly we can normalize lousy situations. There I was, having gotten so used to the little rituals in my life that kept the shadows at bay. I was beginning to divert my attention to other things. like the absence of a love life. I'm not great with online dating. My social circles have been frozen since graduation, plus I work from home mostly. Added to the challenge of finding dates, I was constantly wondering how on earth I would take a girl home to a haunted house. That was how I met Ella. Ella was the exact opposite of a girl that I would bring home to meet my mother. She was tattooed, pierced in all the wrong places. Well, all the right places, if you're me, I suppose. She smoked, wore heavy makeup, her thick, wavy hair dyed an electric purple. We met at a geek convention in another town. She was a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend, and we learned we both lived in the same city. We somehow ended up hanging out around the same group because of, shared hometown, and although I couldn't take my eyes off of her, I had no idea how to strike up a conversation with her. My friend Vivian, however, forever my wingman, noticed me eyeing Ella, but doing nothing about it. So, she happened to let spill in conversation that I lived in a haunted house. "Really?" Ella squealed, her pink contacts locking with mine properly for the first time. I actually don't like talking about the conditions of my house. It's like thinking about a room that you should have cleaned out months ago. Except now the pile of clothes on the floor has been lying there for so long, it's developed a taste for human flesh. Yeah, I found myself saying, like really haunted. "I don't actually know why you still live there," V added. Ella clapped her hands like a little girl. "Oh my God, all right, tell me everything." So I did. She listened intently, gasping and nodding all the time. I don't remember any girl giving me this much attention for quite some time. "Listen, you may not believe me, but I've been living with my guardian spirit and a whole bunch of other spirits my entire life. I've got the third eye, and I can see things that people can't. It's so rare to find a real haunting. Can I please, please, please visit your house?" Ella begged. That's when several alarm bells started going off in my head. Firstly, who on earth goes out seeking these kinds of things with such glee? Secondly, bringing someone into the house who was so eager to get a reaction from the entities sounded as good an idea as poking a bear. Knocks had proven to be benign. The basement thing, on the other hand, I was certain had the capacity to maim and kill. But in a city far from home, under bright sunshine, with the rapt attention of a beautiful girl, I said I suppose she could try. As the convention went on, Ella became quite friendly with me. Yet it still surprised me that she said yes when I asked her out on a date. We went on our first date the evening the convention ended. Before we parted, she gave me a kiss on the cheek, and I promised her a tour of my house. A week later, Friday afternoon, she came over. When she got out of her car, she was rapt. I don't know what she saw when she looked at my house, but I guess it was everything she had hoped for. Now that it was actually happening, I was pretty nervous as I brought her around the place. Knox stayed strangely quiet. Perhaps he was used to people being apprehensive, as opposed to enthusiastic. However, upon entering the laundry room, 2 sharp raps sounded on the wall. Ella laughed excitedly and put her hands over her mouth. I quickly grabbed her by the shoulder and led her out of the room. I hesitated at the basement door, but she really wanted to go down there. It was the main attraction, after all. I'd been down there before, but that was before my last harrowing experience. Since then, I actually hadn't gone down there. It was still daylight, and the basement thing seemed dormant by day. So, not believing what I was doing for a pretty girl, I agreed to a very short visit downstairs. I warned her to keep her voice low, and she promised that if I said to leave, she would leave. She promised. So, very cautiously, I opened the basement door. I had not fixed the broken light in there, but there was enough light from the kitchen we could see all the way down. Holding her hand, I led her down the stairs. It was as I remembered it. Old, dusty tables with chairs stacked upside down against one wall. A little further on the opposite wall, an odd opening jutted into it. I've never understood what that space was for. You might have a small fridge in it if you were lucky, and only if it was lying on its side. Were it not for the yellow-painted diagonal scaffolding that crisscrossed it, that was. The space was its lair. Ella suddenly went ahead of me and approached it. I gripped her hand, and she turned back to look at me with a smile and intent in her eye. I shook my head at her, but she let my hand fall and approached the space noiselessly. She placed her hands within the foreboding area and beamed to herself. I would have grabbed her and forced her out of the basement, had I not been terrified of waking the entity with noise and clamor. To my relief, Ella retreated, seeming satisfied. She reached back, holding my hand again, and we left the basement. Once we were out and I'd shut the basement door, Ella burst into squealing joy. "That was amazing! I've never felt such an aura. Trust me, I have spent nights in so many abandoned buildings and so many graveyards. Most everything's rubbish, but oh my God, you have the real deal." It was about 4 in the afternoon then. It was still light, but for the last few months I tended to have dinner early so that I could retreat to my bedroom well before night. This led to an odd puzzle I'd been musing over. If I chose to bring Ella out for dinner, I might be returning to the house well after dark, which was far from preferable. If we ate at home, I would have to ask Ella to leave early, which seemed a little rude and against my wishes to spend more time with her. Ella provided the solution before I even presented the option to her. "Would you mind if I stayed the night?" I gulped nervously. Well, I could cook us an early dinner, and I guess we could watch a movie in my room. It's the safest place in the house after dark." She nodded enthusiastically, with bright, shining eyes. I'll spare everyone the details of the evening, but let's just say being in a haunted house really excited her. Something weird happened in the morning, though. I went into the attached bathroom to brush my teeth. Looking in the mirror, I saw Ella pop her head around the corner and look at me. It was only for a moment, then she ducked out. I finished brushing my teeth and went back into the bedroom. Ella was under the covers, still looking asleep. "You can use the bathroom now," I said. "Huh?" she said, sleepily turning over. "Oh, I thought you wanted the bathroom." She shook her head, her purple hair rippling across her face. Before I could pursue the matter any further, she got up and let the blankets fall off and pulled me into a kiss. Any questions I had blanked out of my mind. Like I said, the house really seemed to excite her. She was back a couple of weeks later. She would have returned sooner, but she had work stuff. She worked at a gallery and a series of event centers, and they'd had some talks that night. When she got out of her car, she was wearing an outfit that most certainly got my blood running. Whatever excitement I might have felt was put to a slow death when she opened her passenger door to reveal the most terrifying object I'd ever seen. An old, weathered doll. I'm even more petrified of dolls than I am of the dark, and that's saying something. "Hey, I want you to meet my lifelong friend, Edward. He's my spirit guide, and he's so happy to be here," she said, introducing the doll. Edward was a thing of my nightmares. Seeming made of pink plastic, he was 4 feet in length and wore a faded sleeping gown that matched his nightcap. It may have once sported some kind of pattern of sorts, but it now just looked blotched and diseased. His face was worn, and worse, the paint was stained and smeared in all manner of ways, giving the doll the impression of having been melted in a fire, as well as mauled by a bear, maybe. It seemed to glare at me with its jet black eyes, and its smile was unsettling, to say the least, like a snake that spotted its next meal. He was my Nan's. That's great. Hey, Ed, you're not bringing him inside, are you?" Ella smiled at me and put a hand on my arm. She stood beside me, turning to face the creepy doll sitting in the car. Then she whispered in my ear, "Don't call him Ed. He doesn't like it. It's Edward. And of course I'm bringing him into the house. Look, I really don't think that's a good idea. It's okay. Edward can move around a bit on his own, but he's never hurt me, and there's his seal, she said. She lifted his nightcap and showed me a strange symbol that had been seared into his bald plastic head. She put it back down. Nan told me that he's safe as long as the seal remains intact. He moves around? Just a little. He's not coming into the house. Ella made a face that seemed to ask if I was serious and call me a coward at the same time. Then she suddenly had a look on her face like she was hearing something that only she could really hear, and she leaned towards Edward. Huh? Oh, okay. Edward says he understands and he'll stay in the car. She closed the car door and looked mildly disappointed, but she gave me a smile and grabbed my hand as she led me into the house. I noted that she hadn't locked her car, but didn't say anything, as I felt I'd gotten as much of a compromise as I was going to get. I could feel the doll's eyes on me all the way back to the house. We'd finished watching a movie together in bed, and it was close to midnight. Ella was lying against me, and I could tell that she was bored. Suddenly, she sat up with a mischievous grin on her face. Let's go. Go where? Explore your house, duh. Ella, I know you're really into this kind of thing, but the basement thing isn't something that you want to mess with. I have protection, she said dismissively. Come on, let's go. I can't believe you're not curious. I'm very not curious. What do you mean protection? Look, I don't want to get into it, but I used to be in a sisterhood and we made deals. It was kind of messed up and I got out okay, but some of those contracts were binding both ways. So things don't mess with me and I have Edward. Come on. Her plastic friend's protection was not convincing, and I didn't budge an inch. All right, fine, she said, a wild gleam in her eye. I'm going by myself. You wait here. What? Wait, no. But she'd already flung the door open and run out into the house. It had been a while since I faced the darkness of my home. I heard her footsteps going down the stairs. Then she said something that I couldn't quite make out. I was frozen on my bed, listening for more sounds, but there was only silence. When I couldn't take it anymore, I crept out of bed and approached the open door. Ella, I said, my voice hoarse. There was no response down the stairs. I looked on the floor and noted that her feet had scraped my iron filings aside. I grabbed a small broom I had and put them back in a line across the threshold, hoping to keep whatever was in the basement at bay. Then I took a step over the black dust line into the corridor. 2 groans shuddered through the house. 2 for no. It was Knox. But I had never heard it sound like that before. Deep and loud. I got the impression of a cat bristling, trying to appear 3 times its size. Was Knox angry? Or was he scared? The last time I went against Knox's advice had been when my niece had gone into the basement, but the circumstances felt different now. My instincts screamed at me, and I made my way down the stairs despite them. At the top of the landing, I flicked on the stair light. Edward stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at me. God! I yelled, falling over. I scrambled backwards till my back hit the wall. Edward's eyes appeared black and empty, like a shark's. Ella! I cried out. I thought we agreed the doll stays in the car. There was no reply. Ella! I called out again. I'm going back in my room and locking the door. Still no response. If you want back in, just knock on the door and tell me, okay? Picking myself up, I ran back to my room, constantly glancing back at the stairs, half expecting Edward to appear on the landing. I slammed the door behind me, flipped the lock, and slid to the floor, breathing hard. Hours went by, and I didn't hear a sound for the rest of the night. Not even the creak of wood from Knox. I think I fell asleep with my back against the door, because I suddenly realized it was dawn. My windows were gray, and I could make out the silhouette of the treetops. I really needed the bathroom at that point. Hoping the morning brought my usual safety, I left my vigil over the door and went to the bathroom. Just in the middle of my business, I saw movement in the mirror. I couldn't see directly into my room, but I could see into the bedroom via the mirror. It was Ella. She appeared to have entered the bedroom and was crossing to the other side. To get her phone, maybe, I thought. "Ella?" I called out. Pulling up my pants and flushing the toilet, I hurried out, but Ella wasn't in the room. My room door was locked. How had she gotten in? How had she gotten out again? I didn't see her phone either. Had she taken it downstairs with her last night? I decided my sleep-deprived brain was just playing tricks on me. Frowning, I steeled myself and opened the bedroom door. The landing was empty. I stepped out into the corridor, listening for knocks to sound again, but I only heard morning birdsong. Very gingerly, I tiptoed to the stairs and looked down. Edward was nowhere to be found. I descended to the ground floor, and the house felt empty. Neither Edward nor Ella were anywhere to be seen. When I checked the driveway, her car was gone. When I'd gone through all the rooms, just in case Edward was hiding somewhere, I sighed, got my phone, and called Ella. She didn't pick up. I sent her a few messages throughout the morning, but I got no reply. Feeling lost about what to do, I began cleaning up the house. But as time went on, I began to get that odd feeling that I wasn't alone. While Knox was a somewhat omnipresent being in the house, I hadn't felt spooked by it for a long time. I started to get goosebumps. Someone or something was watching me. My next glimpse of what it was happened in my garage. There's a long, full-length mirror stood against the wall in there that I'd never found a place for, so there it stayed. I saw Ella in it, poking her head out from one side of the garage entrance. I spun around thinking she'd come back, but there was no one there. I went outside, but I didn't see her car either. I heard a creak from the house. Knox? What was that supposed to mean? A bit later, still feeling lost, I decided I'd drive to the supermarket and stock up. The store wasn't far, and being around people milling and shopping might make me feel better. The fear from the previous night had turned into disappointment that Ella had just vanished on me. I was driving home when I glanced into the rearview mirror, and Ella was staring back at me from the back seat. I screamed, accidentally stepping on the gas, and sent my car up the curve. The car jolted to a stop before I hit a small tree and somehow managed to unfasten my seatbelt, tumbling out the door and scrambling away from the vehicle. But I stopped after a few feet. What if Ella was stuck in the car and needed help? I came back to the car, cautiously, as though it might blow up any second. But the back seat was empty. It wasn't just that Ella shouldn't have been in the back seat of my car. It was the expression she'd had. She'd been smiling at me with a deranged look in her eye. I checked all my tires, and it appeared intact. The car looked drivable, but I didn't want to drive. I didn't even want to test it. Instead, I called V. "Hey, I really need your help." She must have heard the tension in my voice. Without question, she rolled up to me 20 minutes later. "You okay?" she asked, getting out of the car. Yeah, I'm fine. I don't think I can drive right now." V frowned at me and looked at the car. "I can take you home, but what are you going to do about your car?" We were in a small housing estate, and the road itself was pretty quiet. No one had come out to see what had happened during the accident. "You reckon I could leave it here for the night?" I asked. V shrugged. "Well, at least park it straight. Here, give me your keys." I handed V the keys, hoping it would be safe to let her inside the car. She parked the car without incident and came out. I felt relieved when she was fine, but then I felt sick. V gave me a concerned look as she walked back to me. "Hey, what's going on? Talk to me." I could only stare at the ground. not even sure where to start. Evening was coming, and shadows were drawing up long across the ground. Do you think I could stay at yours tonight? I asked V. I don't think my house is safe to go back to. I don't think I should be alone. V put her arms around me and led me back to her car. I totally forgot about my groceries. I sat in the passenger seat and was silent the whole drive, doing my best not to look into the mirror. When we got to V's, I broke down and cried. V hugged me and rubbed my back as though I were a kid. After a bit, while holding back sobs, I told V what had transpired over the last couple of weeks. She nodded in an understanding manner and didn't interrupt. At the end of it, she took a look around her house, stood up, and started putting stuff away. I realized she was clearing away anything that had a reflection on it. When she was done, she sat opposite me and took out her phone. Well, she said in a problematic tone, I think it's time you got some help. What, a psychologist? No, I was thinking more exorcist. What? Maybe a priest or a pastor. I decided to open my phone and start searching too. Just as I was about to press the first link on my search bar, my phone started ringing. Ella? I said, putting the phone to my ear. V looked back as her eyebrows raised. Hey, can we meet, like somewhere in town? Yeah, I said slowly. I have questions. I know, I'm sorry, Ella replied. She gave me the address of a cafe in town. I'll tell you what I can when we meet, she said, and abruptly put the phone down. V had her arms crossed when I looked up at her. Could you give me a ride? She better have a good explanation, V said, getting up and grabbing her jacket. The cafe had a small park across from it. V said she'd sit on a bench at the edge of the park, keeping me in sight. Ella was already sitting at a table out on the footpath with a cup of coffee before her. She wasn't drinking it, and she looked embarrassed. I took a seat opposite her. Hey, she said softly, trying to give me a smile. So, you've been gone for less than a day, but I'm already seeing you everywhere I go, I said with a nervous grin. It wasn't a good joke. Yeah, she said incredulously. I know what you mean. Want to tell me what that's about? It's Edward, she said with a half whisper. He doesn't like you. He really doesn't like you. That made me grit my teeth in anger for some reason. Feeling is definitely mutual. He doesn't want us to spend time with each other anymore, Ella said, staring into her cup. Have you considered that taking relationship advice from a possessed doll is incredibly unhealthy? Says the guy who refuses to move out of his haunted house. Touché, I said with a sigh. Look, I'm sorry. I like you. I really do. You're a sweet guy. You deserve much better, but Edward's all the family I have left. Family? It was Ella's turn to sigh. Sorry, but I have to listen to him. There were tears in her eyes now. No, you don't, Ella, I said, reaching out to hold her hand. Her hand shrank away from mine. He let loose one of them on you, she said quietly. I paused. In my sad, pathetic life, I've done a lot of stupid things. Some bad things. Some of them have led to spirits being attached to me. There's always Edward. I was hoping since you already lived in a haunted house, you would find me and these bizarre things I come with acceptable, I guess. Ella, She raised a hand and cut me off. She took a shaky breath and then mumbled something. I only caught the start of her sentence. He unleashed the what? Its name means the one who walks the mirrors. It was one of the spirits Edward's protecting me from. I think he trapped it within himself. Now he's let it go. It'll haunt your reflection, traveling from one mirror to the next. It can even come out, I think. My blood ran cold. I stopped breathing. Can it be stopped? Ella shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't know. I'm sorry. I've said too much already. Then, before I could stop her, she ran to her car. "Wait, why does it look like you? What does it want?" I cried after her. She didn't answer. She got into her car and started the engine. I saw Edward strapped into the passenger seat. I could feel those venomous black eyes boring into me. As Ella drove past, I swear the thing turned to stare at me. Have you ever felt so scared that your guts feel like they're going to empty its contents in both directions at the same time? Yet at the same time, a desperate anger lit a small flame against the hopelessness inside of me. It was the smile on Edward's face that did it. It was a victorious smile. Edward had gotten the girl and destroyed his competition. Except I wasn't destroyed yet, was I? My muscles felt like they were made of jelly, but somehow I stood up in defiance, with my fist clenched, staring at Ella's car as it drove out of sight. V had crossed the road and was approaching me. "What happened? Are you okay?" I turned to V. I was shivering badly, but I couldn't tell from dread or fury. "I got a plan," I told her through gritted teeth. "That doll, that goddamn doll. It thought I didn't remember what the symbol on its head looked like." Later at my house, I think it was about 10:30, I stood with V in the living room. She was holding a simple hand mirror. I was preparing a couple of things on the countertop. "You're crazy. This is the dumbest thing I've ever done. And I've seen some pretty dumb stuff." "Yeah," I grimaced. Knox had been quiet. There was no presence from the basement either. It was as if both understood that what I was doing was important, and they were giving me room to do so. V had been uncomfortable entering the house. She had a bad experience with Knox once. I told you about that. I told her she didn't need to do this for me, but she insisted that someone had to save my ass if everything went to hell. I felt it approaching. The feeling that I was being watched deepened. I put my finger to my lips and V simmered down. Silently, I motioned for V to pass me the hand mirror. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and held it up so I could see my face in it. I then angled it so I could see over my shoulder. Behind me was the archway to the kitchen, which was lit by a soft orange glow. I didn't have to wait long. Something that might have been Ella popped its head to the right of the arch, then ducked away. The hair on my neck stood on end. A few minutes crept by, and V was shifting uncomfortably, foot to foot, her eyes darting from one shadow to another. I kept my eyes on the mirror, though. Then, even though I was expecting it, it was all I could do not to scream as a pale face with purple hair peeked over my shoulder. It smiled at me with a thin black smile and stared at me with unblinking eyes. It didn't really look like Ella, not close up. I frowned back at it, waiting to see what it would do. I think my defiance angered it, as its smile turned into a baring of teeth that were long and inhuman. I heard V gasp by my side. I think she had seen it in the mirror. Her gasp made me take my eyes off it for a split second. When I glanced back, I saw a white hand shooting out, filling the whole mirror, as if it meant to grab my face. I let go of the mirror and ducked to avoid the grasping hand. The mirror and I tumbled onto the carpeted floor, and V shrieked. That's when it got quiet. I got up and looked down. The mirror had landed face up, and I could see the thing thrashing about inside it. It appeared to be snarling and screaming, but I could hear nothing. Its background seemed to have frozen too. Rather than the ceiling, the mirror contained the living room and the kitchen archway, the same as it had when I was holding it. The thing was running around the mirror room in a hobbling fashion, but it didn't seem to be able to find its way out. It just kept running back and forth, and then it returned to the mirror's surface to thump and scream against it once more. I could hear V screaming her head off. Slowly I knelt down and held the mirror by its handle, lifting it up. I felt like I had a deadly spider in my hand, separated by a thin layer of glass in the container. "You're insane. You are actually insane," I heard V still going on. In the reverse of the mirror, I had etched under the plastic the symbol I'd seen on Edward's cap. My gamble had worked. I'd lured the mirror demon into this mirror, on the off chance that the seal would trap it within. The theory could have gone wrong on so many levels. What if it required more than just the symbol to turn the mirror into a trap? What if the mirror demon couldn't be trapped the same way that Edward had in the doll? What if the mirror demon had used a different mirror to attack me? I don't know. All I knew was that it had worked. I put the mirror in a soft cloth bag and tightened the drawstring. Then I put the bag into a small safe box I had previously used for my passports and things. I'd stuffed it full of padding. I heard the safe box click as the numbers went back into something that wasn't the combination. I also put a padlock onto the ring that it had. On the safe and the padlock, I also drew the symbol with the permanent marker. V appeared to have calmed down somewhat now that the mirror was out of sight. "All right," she said, trying to catch her breath. "Okay, you caught the thing. Congrats, genius. You won. What now?" I stepped back from the locked safe, blood still rushing in my ears as I breathed heavily. V was right. I'd won. I'd allowed the feeling of victory to wash over me. For a moment, I felt like I could have taken on the entire world. Then I remembered the thing in the basement. My courage was somewhat humbled. Now I think I'm going to drink a very large glass of water. Then one day I'm going to cover this safe in cement. Then I'm somehow going to get a boat and drop it in the middle of the ocean. A single rap sounded from somewhere in the house. Vivian jumped as ever. It's okay, I said, putting a hand on her to calm her. I think the house was agreeing with me. "Hey, that offer to stay over at yours still stand?" V nodded at me and looked pale, unconvinced that Knox meant her no harm. "Let's say we get out of here then." I put the safe in my closet, then closed up the house. V followed me close everywhere, and Knox was very polite about not scaring her further. I left extra milk and bread by the basement as a thank you for giving me my space. I hope it understood the gesture. Then we left my house of horrors, at least for that night. What follows, I guess, is a bit of epilogue on the whole affair, and the preemptive questions I'm anticipating. Firstly, yes, V is a good friend whom I'm surprised to be blessed with. I surprised her the week after with a brand new game console that I know she'd been waiting for. Then there's the issue of keeping the mirror. Would smashing the mirror kill the thing or release it? I don't know. I felt unconfident about testing it. So I didn't break it. I faced the problem and kept wanting to keep it in sight at all times, not wanting it out of sight ever. In the end, I compromised on my rule. I cooperated with Knox. It seemed to not like the thing any more than I did. We found a place in the house it approved of hiding it. I won't say where. Then I just trusted that Knox would guard it and warn me if anything happened. If anyone's going to ask me what the symbol is, I won't tell you. V thinks that it might get cults or something looking for me, and I've got enough problems to deal with. Thank you very much. Sorry, I truly hope I don't run into the mirror demon again. Finally, was I serious about cementing the mirror and dropping it in the ocean? I was, in fact. I just have to find someone who's willing to take on a job like that, of cementing a mystery box when other things started to happen. It's not the last time I had to deal with the mirror demon. There's still Entity 4 and 5 to tell you about, though. Perhaps I'll tell you a little more sometime.